Hi guys, it's Mrs. Schacht here, and I'm here to discuss the effects of the Great Depression on America, as well as the effects on specific groups of Americans. And so the first place I'd like to start is employment. So in order to survive, right, in the United States, one needs a job and they need money to pay for the basic necessities. And unfortunately, during the Great Depression, many jobs were lost and unemployment reached a historic height of almost 25% in 1933. So essentially, 1 out of 4 Americans was out of work. If one does not have a job and doesn't have a source of income, it's obviously difficult to pay for basic necessities as well as homes. And so, additionally, this is going to result in over 100,000 businesses failing. The average income of Americans is going to decrease pretty significantly in a short amount of time. And of course, many, over 600,000, are going to lose their homes in the process. So, unfortunately, for many Americans, if they lost their homes because they couldn't pay the mortgage, many Americans created these kind of makeshift homes that you can see in this photo, using any sort of material or scrap metal they could find. And these little villages, if you will, of these homes became known as Hoovervilles. And they're named after former President Herbert Hoover. And obviously, it's a very critical name of his policies and kind of lack of action at the very beginning of the Great Depression. You're going to hear quite a bit about the New Deal and all of the programs that FDR implemented to address jobs and housing and farmers. But one specific program that I'd like to address here is the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA, which was created in 1934. And it was created with the intent of providing Americans with affordable housing, requiring Americans to have a smaller down payment and the ability to spread their mortgage out over a longer period of time. However, one practice that was implemented with the FHA was called redlining. And this is a practice that's going to have devastating effects for years to come. And in fact, we actually can still see evidence of its impact today. So if you take a look at this map of Philadelphia in 1937, you'll notice various neighborhoods are color-coded: blue, green, yellow, and red. Essentially, if you lived in the blue and green zones, you were more than likely able to get a mortgage, a loan from the bank to purchase a home. However, if you lived in these red areas were considered financially risky, and many banks refused to give loans for mortgages to these areas in red. And every city had a map like this. However, it's important to note that the majority of the citizens in these areas are minorities. And so this is essentially denying an opportunity to purchase homes for many African Americans across the country. And if you look at some of these statistics today, you can see how, 44% of African Americans, are homeowners versus 73.7% of whites. And so, like I said, this is going to have some long-term devastating effects going forward in American history. Many American families dealt with a slew of issues during the Great Depression. Marriages were put on hold, so the marriage rate went down, the divorce rate went down. Unfortunately, many teenagers had to drop out of high school to try and find jobs to help support their families, and many men had to leave their families and find jobs wherever they could. So approximately 1.5 million women did not live with their husbands during this time. Additionally, these men, as I mentioned, would kind of hop a train illegally. Oftentimes they were referred to as hobos, and they would, like I said, travel anywhere they could to find work to support their families. The farmers are probably one of the hardest hit during the Great Depression. Not only do the farmers, many of them lose their land, again, because they're unable to pay the mortgage on their land. In fact, 33% of farmers lost their farms. But total farm income in general begins to decrease significantly during the 1930s. And a lot of this can be attributed to the Dust Bowl. If you look at this photo here, you'll notice this looks like a tornado cloud, and that's essentially what dust storms were. There was no rain, so there was a severe drought. High winds would kick up all of the dust and the topsoil, and towns across the United States would be pummeled by these dust storms. This map shows you that between 1930 and 1940, you can see that the area in red was the hardest hit by these horrific storms. Yellow saw a lot of damage as well, but just kind of an aside and a fun fact, these storms were so powerful that the dust from the Great Plains states made its way to cities like Chicago, New York, and even Boston. So this dust was kind of kicked out all across the country. Unfortunately, this caused many Americans not only to have, if they still had their farms, their land was completely damaged, but there were 350,000 farmers in Oklahoma that became nicknamed Okies, and they made their way to California searching for a better life. And the topic of a very famous American novel called The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck focuses on the journey of these Okies. So again, you can see just the sheer damage of these storms among American farmers. I do want to talk specifically about a few more groups. So the first is women. There are some great strides that are made during this time, but there are also some challenges that women still face. One great kind of milestone is that Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed Frances Perkins as his Secretary of Labor, and she becomes the first woman to hold a cabinet position. You also have this lady here, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who really was considered to be the first lady to actively participate in politics. On top of that, there were some women that were employed by New Deal programs. The Works Progress Administration, or the WPA, employed over 400,000 women. However, most other programs excluded women. And even though some women saw gains in employment, we're going to see even larger gains, when America enters World War II. And once again, women will enter the workforce by the millions and help the war effort. African Americans kind of see the same trends. There are some great strides made, but civil rights and full equality is not something that the New Deal addresses during this time period. Approximately 18% of WPA jobs, or Works Progress Administration jobs, were held by African Americans, and FDR did appoint some African Americans to various New Deal programs to help him run them. However, like I said, full equality and civil rights is not something that is addressed or achieved during this time period. Despite all of that, many African Americans do support FDR politically. And something that shifts during this time is who supports the Democratic Party. And many historians refer to this as the New Deal coalition. So I want to talk about just a couple of these groups, but if you think about it, many African Americans supported Republicans during and after the Civil War, specifically the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln. But what you're going to start to see is you're going to start to see a shift of who supports Democrats and who supports Republicans. And you're going to see some new groups beginning to support Democratic candidates. Many white Southerners, specifically Southern farmers, are going to start to support FDR and Democratic candidates for all that he does for farmers. Labor unions do see an increase in membership, so many members of labor unions will support FDR and Democratic candidates. Many African Americans and women and kind of progressives will do so as well. And so you start to see a shift of the types of Americans who support Democratic candidates. And for the most part, from Roosevelt's presidency all the way through approximately 1968, Democrats will dominate the presidency, the only exception being Dwight D. Eisenhower, who serves during the 1950s. So this kind of shift of who supports Democrats and this dominance of the Democratic Party for the next 30, 40 years is known as the New Deal coalition. Additionally, Native Americans actually do see some gains and some changes during this time period. There was a Bureau of Indian Affairs created in 1933, and one impact of that was the Indian Reorganization Act, which was created in 1934. This basically repealed the Dawes Act from previous chapters, if you guys remember. It returned land to Native American tribes, and it basically allowed Native Americans to preserve their culture and to return to their land, their culture, and try and improve upon that land. And so many Native American tribes were given full autonomy over their land. And then the last group I'd like to speak about are Mexican Americans. So many Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants worked specifically in agricultural jobs, a lot in California and out west. And with the decrease in farming prices and the high rates of unemployment, one government program that's pretty controversial is one that becomes known as Mexican repatriation. And essentially, our government deported over 500,000 Mexican American citizens and immigrants back to Mexico so that there were more jobs available for Americans. And it's important to note that of those who were deported, 60% were actually legal citizens of our country. And so this is obviously a very devastating impact. Again, this is known as Mexican repatriation. This will change with World War II and will kind of reopen jobs to Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants. But like I said, over 500,000 were deported during this time. So guys, that is a lot. I hope you can see just how many groups of people were impacted in very different ways throughout the Great Depression. And I hope